you very much to the Society for inviting me to speak to you this evening about the Northgate development. Peter has explained a little bit about the background to the service, and for those of you who don't know, the Archaeology Planning Advisory Service is a shared service which is based in Cheshire West Council in Chester, but we're a shared service with Cheshire East Council, and we provide development management. We also maintain the historic environment record for those areas. I tend to deal primarily with Cheshire West, whereas my colleague Kirsty Lloyd, who I think might actually be here this evening, actually deals with Cheshire East and Warrington, and my other colleagues Rob, Moya and Jane, who I know many of you will know, maintain the historic environment record. Before we progress on to the slides, just a little bit about the nature of the project and today's talk, really, because the thrust of things has been, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has been very much preservation in situ of the archaeological remains. So there is some archaeology to see, and some quite interesting and well-preserved archaeology, but much of this will be about the approach that we've taken, the methodology that we adopted to secure the preservation in situ of the archaeological deposits. And people may have questions about that at the end, which I'm quite happy to do my best to answer. The second thing that I think I really ought to say is that, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the development, or at least phase one, is really steaming ahead now, and will be opening before too long. And the project to secure the preservation of the archaeological remains has been very much a sort of collaborative project. And I think it's very important to emphasise, well, I feel very strongly that the success, which I hope people will agree this has been at the end of the talk, has been very much a result of that collaborative approach. And I think it's important to pay particular tribute to Oxford Archaeology North, both their consultancy branches, Rachel Newman, who has advised CWaC on the archaeological implications of things, but also their contracting arm, who've done a great job dealing with the archaeology, implementing the strategy that we've adopted under the management of Paul Dunn. Also important to say that we've had great support from the CWaC construction team. And I don't think without their buy-in to what we've done that we would have been able to achieve what we did. Also Vinci Construction as well, very new to them really, but they've taken it all on board and worked closely with us. And finally, and by no means least, Historic England, particularly Andrew Davison, the inspector, who's provided, as ever, really sort of top-notch strategic support throughout the project. So anyway, that's a little bit of just the background and the philosophy. But perhaps now we could just move on to the next slide, please. Right. So this is a sort of just a brief project timeline, much of which I'm sure will be familiar to many people here tonight. So we could go back into the depths of time and everything and, review the construction of the original Forum shopping centre. But in the interests of moving things ahead, I thought we'd start in about 1996 when things really got going again with regard to what has led to the present development, really. And there were, of course, as I'm sure people remember, various design iterations. Things did really advance quite some way around about 2007 and 8, but that scheme then fell away, basically, and work then began on the development of the scheme that we see today. Important to emphasise, of course, that we're only talking about phase one of the project at the moment, essentially the northern part of the development area, bounded by Northgate to the east, Nicholas Street to the west, Hunter Street to the north and Princess Street to the south. But in 2015, we saw the beginning of a new round of evaluation work carried out by Oxford Archaeology North. And this obviously, there was a vast amount of previous work, some of which Peter alluded to in his introduction, but also trial trenching work with regard to various iterations of the scheme. But in 2015, we sat down and we tried to agree what really needed to be done at an early stage to answer specific questions about areas that we perhaps didn't know quite enough about if we were trying. So OA North carried out some evaluation work in 2015. We'll see some slides of that later, but it's particularly important, useful, I think, to draw attention to the work that was done on the east side of the underpass at the Crown Plaza Hotel, where we thought we wondered, whether the skeletons had all been removed that were associated with the burial ground around the former Unitarian church. It seemed probable that they had been, but in fact, it turned out that they hadn't, and the western part of the graveyard was still largely preserved beneath the development. That isn't relevant to phase one of the project, obviously, because that falls within what will become phase two, but that was very much the beginning of the field work that was associated with the main phase of the project that we see today. In 2016, CWaC, Cheshire West, the construction team, commissioned Oxford Archaeology North to produce a desk-based assessment for the current scheme. So that's the scheme in phase one that is currently being built with the cinema, the new plaza, the multi-storey car park, etc. And the aim of that desk-based assessment was to bring all the previous information together, which I think they did very, very effectively, particularly John Zant, who was the main author of that, and to define the scope of any further evaluation work that needed to be done in order to assist in designing a foundation plan for the development, which would do minimal damage to the archaeology. The aim was that we wouldn't lose more than 3% of significant archaeology within the areas that were of particular significance within the development area. We'll see that in a bit more detail later on. But obviously we needed really, really detailed information about all areas of the development, particularly those where there were going to be unavoidable intrusions, in order to work towards that, that goal. So subsequently to that, we then saw in tandem with, in many instances, pre the determination of the planning application in 2019, various phases of watching brief during geotechnical works, evaluation work, also with regard to off-site drainage work. And that's particularly important because off-site drainage work does not form part of the planning permission. It is permitted development. And you will have seen around Chester utility companies digging up, digging trenches, repairing, water mains, gas mains on a regular basis. The new services that were necessary for this development fell within that. But I think the CWaC development team took the view, once we've discussed it, that it was important that the new services were included within the overall calculation of the loss of significant archaeology, so that we wouldn't have a situation where we all congratulated ourselves on the end of the development, doing a great job, and then the services came in and made a huge mess, digging holes everywhere. As you can see, further phases of evaluation and watching briefs throughout 2020. So quite a complex process centered around the periods before and after the determination of the planning application. And this was all really before the main phase of development got going. So perhaps if we could just move on to the next slide, please, Niall. Okay, so I think it would be useful to just remind ourselves of the extent of the development. That this is the red line boundary, which again, I'm sure would be very, very familiar to many people, but it shows the totality of the Northgate development area. So it includes areas which are excluded from phase one of the development, such as the present market hall, the Forum shopping centre and the offices, and the area to the south, such as Goldsmith House. Those aspects of Northgate have not been abandoned in any way, but what we're dealing with tonight is phase one of the development, which is of course centred on the old bus station and what was the Pocket Park to the west. As we said earlier, it's the land bounded by Northgate Street, Hunter Street, Nicholas Street and Princess Street. So that northern area that we can see on that plan. Could we have the next slide, please, Niall? Okay, probably important to say something about the archaeological character areas, because of course we all know that the archaeology in this area is very sensitive, nationally important and everything. But of course it's a matter when we're dealing with development management processes of actually expressing what we know to be true in terms that are robust and valid in planning terms. Of course, much of the central core of Chester is included in the area of archaeological importance, and has been for many years. That's a statutory designation under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act from 1979. And that's a very useful designation in the fact that it highlights the importance of the area, but it doesn't actually, unfortunately, because when it was formulated in 79, developer funded archaeology wasn't there. So it doesn't actually provide us with much of a useful mechanism these days for addressing the archaeology. But at a more local level, a few years ago now, the council obtained funding from, English Heritage at the time, now Historic England, to carry out the Chester Archaeological Urban Database. And 2 project officers were employed to assemble all the information that was currently available in terms, maybe not published or in the public domain, to try and define particular areas, the nature of the archaeology within particular areas, how well preserved it was. And there are people who are here today, Peter Carrington, who played a major part as well in advising on that project. And as you can see here, numerous character areas were defined across Chester, the historic core of Chester. And these are the ones that were actually affected by the Northgate scheme. So each of these areas has text explaining what the nature of the archaeology is, how well preserved it is, where it has been destroyed, as obviously it has in some of the areas. And that fed into, as well as now being available on our HER as a GIS and can be interrogated, it fed into the Chester Archaeological Plan, which forms part of the evidence base for the Cheshire West and Chester Local Plan. So that gives us some extra ammunition to support what we're saying when we respond to planning applications. And of course, it won't surprise people to hear that most of these zones are characterised as having remains of national significance where they haven't been removed. They may not be scheduled, but planning guidance says that where you've got national remains of national significance, there really is a need to treat them in the same way that you would as if they were scheduled. Okay, if that makes sense. So that's a justification, if you like, for the whole approach that we've taken of preservation in situ. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Helpful, I think, to just remind ourselves of what we might be encountering in the area that was to be disturbed. Again, we're only just dealing with the northern area here. But Peter, thank you to Peter at the start for providing that summary of what had been found in the past with regard to work in the earlier part of the 20th century, and then Tim Strickland's investigations in the late 70s, early 80s on the site of the bus station. We are, of course, looking at the Roman legionary fortress here, and we're to the north of the elliptical building, and you can see the barrack blocks in the western part of the area, and then in the eastern area, that probable stores building that was identified. So that's just a brief outline of the Roman picture. If we move on to the next one, we shouldn't, of course, neglect the later periods, and we were alert to the possibility of early medieval finds and things, not least, of course, because of the discovery of the sunken featured building during the 1979 or the late 70s, early 80s excavations, published by Simon Ward in his volume. So that's the northern notation on that plan, basically. Next one, please. Then again, with the medieval Chester, the lanes, well, there's no Hunters Street at that time, but of course Parsons Lane, I think now Princess Street, Northgate, and what today is Nicholas Street are apparent. The area beyond that looks quite open, and I think that's reinforced by the next slide, please. And this is obviously an early post-medieval plan representation, if you like, of Chester. And I think it's worth drawing attention to the fact that although the Northgate frontage is built up and the Princess Street frontage is built up, and I think what is now the King Street frontage is built up, much of the land behind those street frontages is open ground, basically. And I suppose has likely had remained so since the end of the Roman period. And as we'll see, as we move on to the next slide, please. Again, we have the late 18th century Stockdale map, which shows buildings, within the area, but again, doesn't appear to have been built over to any great extent apart from the street frontage. And the next one, please. So just to bring us up to, well, not quite up to date, because obviously the site has changed massively in the last 2 years, but this is how it looked before the development started. We've got the remains of the bus station with that white square that you can see highlighted there. That's actually the outline of the new plaza or square that is is now in existence within the development, which may help people to orientate themselves. And then the pocket park to the west. All of that soil, of course, was removed basically as development began. So hopefully that just gives people just some sort of flavour of the evidence that we had from the mapping and the topography. But moving on to the next slides, if I could please. Just something to say about the zoning of the development. This is different from the characters, and this owes much, well, pretty well everything actually, to Dr. David Mason and others I know in the former Chester archaeology, which was an attempt to zone the likely archaeological survival within the development area of Northgate as it was initially envisaged. So those areas that are shown in green are areas where archaeology is pretty well certain to have been completely removed, basically. So obviously the site of the Crown Plaza Hotel and the car park area to the south, where we have basement car parking, also the present market hall and the Forum shopping centre with that deep basementing for the car parking, of course, with the important exception of the remains of the bathhouse that was attached to the elliptical building, and that's that area that is marked in black there, not affected by this development, but just to highlight that. moving into our area, Princess Street being that strip of red about a third of the way down the plan, you can see that we've got an area of green at the western area. That is the footprint of that derelict 60s office block that was knocked down some years before the development started, and where we know that the archaeology had been removed. There are other areas shown in yellow where obviously archaeology had been damaged or perhaps completely removed, but there was a chance that archaeology would survive, basically. And obviously a big part of that is the former bus station area, which is therefore shown in yellow. Although, as we'll actually see shortly, there was more survival there than perhaps had been anticipated, which is a good thing because it has been preserved. But in those areas, we would not seek preservation in situ. Preservation in situ, that desire or requirement, if you like, to preserve in situ is restricted to the areas in blue where there was good preservation, thought to be good preservation, or red where the preservation was thought to be exceptional, basically. So that 3%, that aim of securing a development that only damaged 3% of the significant archaeology was focused on those areas that are shown in red and blue on this particular plan. And that's where the work was really done to move ahead to develop a plan that would achieve that aim. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so when we had the timeline, I said that, I appreciate it's all slightly confusing. I myself remain quite confused at times. I have to really think about, the process that we went through. But there were early stage works, really. This was before the application was determined, that were designed to answer specific questions that we didn't feel had been answered by previous evaluation work. So, as I'm sure many of you will recognise, this is a trench. This is a couple of trenches that were dug close to Nicholas Street, where at the west end of Hunter Street, and that's that little pedestrian access up onto what was Hunter Street. And the reason we were interested in that was because the rampart of the Roman fortress is known to survive there, and that break of slope where you rise up is the rampart. And we saw that during the student development on the other side of Hunter Street 2 or 3 years ago now. And what we wanted to know was whether the rampart had gone there completely or whether there was any survival. And we were able to show, as I think you can see from that slide on the right, that we were, obviously the rampart had been completely truncated at that area. And in the trench to the left, which is a slide which is a trench a little bit to the south of this one, there was some survival as you come down onto the natural scattered blocks, probably associated with the fortress wall, but they were at a level where the new road, you will have seen the realignment of Hunter Street, where it does a little bit of kink to the south, and that was put in deliberately to avoid smashing through the remains of the rampart at the western end of Hunter Street. Okay, so it was established over those deposits that we see in those two trenches. I hope that makes sense to people, but if not, I'll be happy to clarify that with questions at the end. So that was a very early stage evaluation and test pit. So if we could move on to the next one, please. Okay, at this early stage, we also took advantage of the various geotechnical works that were carried out. So these weren't really formal evaluation trenches, although they were subject to close evaluation, close observation by the Oxford archaeology staff. And these two slides illustrate the sort of thing that we were interested in. So the one on the left with the ranging rod in it is a hole that I asked to be punched through the concrete floor of or surface of the existing bus station. Because one of the questions that I had, coming new to the project, basically, because before I became development management archaeologist for CWaC, I hadn't dealt with Chester at all, really. And, I had various questions that might or might not be, in retrospect, sensible or not or obvious to anybody with any knowledge of Chester. But anyway, this one on the left made me quite unpopular with the contractors, because not only did they have to get through 500 mil of reinforced concrete, there was also this layer of aggregate underneath it. But what I was keen to understand there was what had been done at the conclusion of Tim Strickland's excavations. Had they taken a bulldozer to everything and just graded it all before putting in the bus station, or had they just covered it all in topsoil, in which case all those archaeological remains would remain, the stone walls anyway, the Roman buildings would probably be there, really. And perhaps to some surprise, when we eventually managed to get to the bottom of this, we found that there was dark soil and hints of walls, not entirely clear in this trench, but it was enough for me to suggest to the construction team that it would be a really, really bad idea to rip off not just the concrete surface of the bus station, but all the aggregate. Because if we exposed all that underlying archaeology, we would have to excavate, well, potentially, certainly plan it all, re-excavate bits that hadn't been fully excavated previously, and write it all up, really. Whereas if they contented themselves with just taking off the concrete and leaving the aggregate in place, then those remains, if they existed, would continue to be preserved in situ. The slide on the right is a trench that was actually cut up against the north side of the market hall. So you're on the south side of Princess Street here, to establish the nature of the services. And as you can see, there were loads of them, basically. But we took advantage of that because we were keen to understand what the overcut was from the construction of the market hall in the 60s. Did the concrete retaining wall mark the limit of the disturbance, or had they cut back to the north and removed lots more archaeology in order to accommodate not the foundation trench, but the working area? And as we found out, there was some disturbance down to about 80 centimetres, but beyond that, they hadn't cut down, they hadn't scraped out the archaeology. So there was good archaeology surviving right up to the cut for the market hall on that south side of Princess Street. And that was useful, important information, because we could then think about designing things like services and piling and all the rest of it in a way that didn't unnecessarily go into that archaeology, because of course we should remember that Princess Street is marked as an area of significant preservation. So all these little bits of information were adding to the picture. Could we move on to the next one, please? And again, more test pit watching briefs, basically. I put the one in on the left because that was just a small trench, which didn't tell us a huge amount, but it actually officially marked the start of the Northgate development. So people may remember there was a bit of a press fanfare there, basically. But also, test pits were dug down Hunter Street. Now, these were dug not because this part of Hunter Street was going to be massively disturbed by the development per se, but because it was going to be affected by the need to realign the services. And what we wanted to understand was what those services, the damage that those services were likely to do to the underlying archaeology, and if possible, to minimize it. The aim being, as we've eventually decided, and as we'll see shortly, to put as many of the services in one trench of restricted width and hopefully depth, so that we minimise the damage to the archaeology. And I think that was a good and innovative thing to do, because, as I said earlier, this is permitted development which the utility companies can put in, but credit to the CWaC construction team in that they said, well, actually, we accept that it's because of this development that these services are going to go in. So we will include those as part of the mitigation, rather than just leaving it to a bolt-on at the end of the development. Two things to note, basically. The one in the bottom right, there are lots and lots of services there, obviously, basically. But by the same token, as you can see in the top left, we've got the dark earth, which it seems to be generated by the sort of post-Roman build-up of topsoil. And as we saw from the earlier maps, that seems to be a process that continued until fairly recently in terms of the land being open ground. Interestingly, that topsoil, when it's dug through, it seems to go down onto what we perhaps slightly glibly and inaccurately call the Roman demolition layer, but the bottom of it often seems to lie directly over collapsed Roman rubble. And you might think, well, it would be later pottery at the top and earlier pottery at the bottom. And there is an element of that. But as we went through it, and this I'm sure will be well known to people who have excavated in Chester, it is pretty mixed all the way to the bottom, basically. It does seem to have been homogenized by agricultural use, bioturbation or whatever, so that there isn't really any stratigraphy in it. And I couldn't help noticing that was a bit different from what we see in places like Middlewich, where we've got a sort of dark earth layer over the Roman deposits. But that dark earth often contains things like Roman floor layers about halfway up the section, which are impermeable to worm action or whatever it is that's causing the bioturbation. We don't seem to see that in Chester, and really our only hope of getting anything, certainly early medieval, we realised would be to see features that were actually cut, into the Roman collapse layer rather than demolition layer. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this picture, this is just to give you some idea of where trenching was done. So many of those green trenches, it doesn't show all the certainly not all the geotechnical pits that we observed and everything, but this is the evaluation trenching, much of it which was carried out specifically in connection with the latest iteration of the scheme. And as you can see, it's been quite extensive, really, although it's worth saying that we did not go down through the aim was to find the top of significant archaeology, which in this case tended to be the Roman collapse layer. That's not to say that we would have ignored anything else. If we'd hit anything later, early medieval that had been well preserved, we would have stopped there, and the preservation in situ strategy would have had to take account of that. But in this instance, all of these trenches were cut to the top of significant archaeology, which tended to be the Roman demolition, or the natural in some instances where the archaeology tended not to survive, or where there have been significant recent damage to the archaeology. So quite an extensive area. And of course, the big trenches that you see there were focused on the areas where there were going to be unavoidable intrusions into the archaeology, deep pile arrays for things like supports for the multi-storey car park, lift shafts and things like that, basically. So it was accepted that obviously there would be some loss of significant archaeology, but as we've said before, the aim is to restrict it to 3%. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is some of the trenching that we carried out. And just to orientate ourselves, the one on the left, if you look to the top right, that's the entrance to the underpass to the Crown Plaza Hotel. And the one on B is a little bit further north of that, just north of Princess Street. So these trenches were excavated in areas where there was going to be unavoidable disturbance. Major pile arrays for the multi-storey car park, as we see in Trench A, or where the core of the big multi-storey car park lift was going to go. And in Trench A, although again you can see those deep accumulations of dark soil in both the trenches, but in Trench A there was Roman archaeology there, but it wasn't desperately well preserved, as we'll see a little bit later. And again in the lift core area, there was again Roman archaeology that had to be dealt with and formed part of the agreed loss. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, more trenching. Trench H is a further one for another array of pile caps, really towards the west end of Princess Street. Lots and lots of services, and in this area, it's all quite difficult collapsing stuff, but this is because that we're dealing with backfilled cellars here from the 18th, 19th century buildings that formerly lined the north side of Princess Street. Interestingly, the other trench, this is a bigger trench that was opened up within the car park area, sorry, the bus station area. So you can see that dreadful reinforced concrete that they had to get through and the aggregate underneath. And then the brown soil, the deep brown soil, but then again, a wall in the right-hand side, which we think is of Roman date. So that was really conclusive proof that at the conclusion of the excavations in 1979-80 on the bus station, they didn't, fortunately, bulldoze the site. They just covered it all over with aggregate. And we assume that what was there at the end of the excavation survives beneath the what was the bus station surface. And I'm pleased to say it pretty well all survives today. In addition, of course, that brown soil indicates, as one would expect, because all excavations are sampling exercises, they're not total excavation, are they? That there remain unexcavated Roman deposits underneath what will be the square of the new shopping centre. Some deposits had to be excavated, and we'll see that in a minute, basically. But yes, a useful discovery and a good outcome there, really, I think. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, it's also important, I think, to mention the off-site drainage evaluation. Many of you will be aware, if only because of the traffic issues that have only recently been relieved with the completion of this project, that the council decided to put in a new drain all the way from the development to discharge into the River Dee. Now, the reason for this is that the new regulations say that you can't have, on a new development, you cannot have rainwater, surface water, discharging into the general sewers, because when there's a storm, the sewers overflow and you end up with raw sewage being discharged into the rivers, and that's been a problem in the River Dee, as in many other areas. So the requirement was either for what they call a sustainable urban drainage system, which effectively means a huge great hole with porous tanks in it within the development area, which would have been obviously hugely archaeologically damaging, or we have a new tunnel or a new drain to discharge purely rainwater into the River Dee. And this is what we've got here. Initially, quite alarming, obviously, because you think, well, that could do huge damage. But key points are, most of it was drilled through the bedrock by this wonderful machine, who I've got some shots of at the end. And the intrusions were restricted to these access shafts that some of you will have, or many of you will have seen during the development. And I've got some slides of those later. But to me, this was a good solution. which, as it turned out, didn't do a huge amount of archaeological damage, or any really, because it avoided a huge hole in the centre of the development to allow the water to soak away. And of course, the environmental benefit of meaning that sewage overflow into the river will undoubtedly be reduced by this development, or this new infrastructure. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as part of that off-site drainage, which again we need to remember is permitted development, we did some evaluation trenches in the Hunter Street area and elsewhere along its line, just to see what we were likely to encounter. So at the west end of Hunter Street, you can see this red area just under the modern tarmac. We were particularly interested in that because there had been suggestions in the past that that might be a Roman surface, very close to the surface. But we were able to demonstrate conclusively that that wasn't the case, because that brown soil underneath it had post-medieval pottery in it. Having said that, the trench, it was clear that archaeology would be disturbed by the feeder trench for the main drain, which was going to run down Hunter Street. And as you can see, these trenches did reveal some archaeology. But anyway, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so when the planning application was submitted, we formalised the approach basically by saying in the red and the blue areas, we would seek preservation in situ and would demonstrate with the planning application submission, as we'll see in a moment, that we were going to be able to achieve that. In the green areas, there would be a watching brief where it was accepted that everything had almost certainly gone, but just to be absolutely sure. And in the yellow areas, in fact, under the bus station, we were able to secure largely preservation in situ rather than just a watching brief, by leaving the aggregate under the concrete surface in place, apart from necessary intrusions for some drainage and some work in the northwest corner, where there was going to be a sort of basement area for the new cinema. We'll see that in a minute. So that submission, that drawing, formalized in simple terms what we were going to achieve. But then if we could move on to the next slide, please. I'm sorry that this isn't very, very clear, but I just couldn't blow it up to a size where you could see all the notation. But this was a more detailed explanation of what we were going to achieve, how we were going to achieve preservation in situ. So you can see in section and in plan, we have the blue and the red areas where preservation in situ was to be achieved, the yellow areas where watching brief preservation in situ was the aim, the green areas with precautionary watching brief. You can ignore the black dotted dash line at the bottom. But if this was blown up, what you would be able to see is where the piles were going to go in, both in plan and in section. And you would also be able to see the level of the archaeological plain plotted in section, so that the level at which significant archaeological deposits occurred. And then we would demonstrate that largely the floor, the concrete floors and underbase of the new development will be raised above that significant archaeology, except in a few places, such as I've mentioned before, where we had lift shafts or particularly deep piling arrays. And the calculations were done on that basis to show we couldn't quite get to 3%. Well, we didn't think we were going to get to 3%. As it turned out, we did manage to, but the projected loss of significant archaeology came in at 3.9%, which I think was, pretty good, really, given the difficulties and the constraints of working, of putting this together. Anyway, next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to that, we submitted generic, or Oxford Archaeology North, I should say, as the contractor, submitted generic written schemes of investigation project designs for the different techniques, the written scheme of investigations for archaeological mitigation, watching briefs, strip and record, archaeological excavation. So everybody knew exactly not just where we were going to do these things, but how we were going to do them. And also these things were all tied up when the planning application was determined. We weren't leaving this to be all sorted out post-determination. That the sensitivity of the archaeological deposits on the site are just so great that we didn't feel that we could take that risk. It all had to be tied up and conditioned so that we all knew where we stood, and everything was backed up by stringent archaeological conditions. Next one, please. Development then began, and what we did, you can see in the bottom of the right, the second column, 3.9% estimated impact. And what we did is we met on two weekly intervals with Oxford Archaeology, the construction team, Vinci, and various other people to review how we were doing and to adjust the total of loss of significant archaeology. And this was one that was preserved but was prepared early in the development. So we're probably talking about, sometime in 2020. And you can see that in the third from the right-hand end, the projected impact has gone down from 3.91% to 3.74%. And that was because it had turned out that less damage needed to be done to the archaeology than had been anticipated. And that was a pattern that continued throughout the development. It went down gradually throughout the period of intrusive works. And in the end, we actually came in at significantly under 3%. I think we were about 2.8%, which, equates to just a few tens of square meters of significant archaeology lost, basically. So those meetings were held, they were a vital part, really, if you like, of securing that, because we were constantly interrogating the approach, seeing what has worked, where things had gone wrong, predicting problems, and, as we can see, reducing the impact on the archaeology. Next slide, please. Okay, so the mitigation service diversion watching brief, this was where we were going to have the biggest impact. We recognised that as we went down Hunter Street. They made the trench narrower than they normally would, and we had tried to plan it in such a way as it didn't unnecessarily go through archaeology. But there was some impact, as we will see. So if we just move to the next slide, please. So yeah, some areas we only needed a watching brief. So at the east end of Hunter Street, on the right-hand slide, just outside the cinema, you can see the area is massively cut about by services, but there were Roman deposits remaining, and those were plotted, and they seemed to tie in with the stores building that was excavated by Tim Strickland. So that all added to the picture, really. That archaeology wasn't actually much more destroyed, to be quite honest. That was the level at which they were working to. At the western end of Hunter Street, there was some archaeology. You can see some tumble here, but that seemed to lie pretty well directly on natural, and there wasn't any huge disturbance. But if we move to the next slides, you can see, this probably should have gone in the first one. If we look along Hunter Street, the areas in green are watching brief, either because they're in areas where we had agreed a watching brief, or in the red, they're in areas where the depth of the trench was such that it would not impact on significant archaeology on the basis of the earlier evaluation. But the areas in red are those where there would need to be archaeological excavation work, basically. So if we move to the next trench. So this is the water drainage trench. So the slide on the left shows a fairly early stage in the excavation of that feature. I think everybody can orientate themselves quite easily there. You can see that there are modern services intruding. but also walls beginning to appear. If we move on to the trench, looking at the trench on the right, you can see that the natural has appeared at the base of the trench, cut by some features, and there are surfaces of Roman date above that. There are walls in section or stone structures rising pretty well up to the surface, but those were not Roman. They seem to be garden features associated with when the ground was open ground in the post-medieval period. And indeed, that wall that you can see just in front of the person with the well, it's not a ranging rod, is it? It's a GPS plotting thing. That seemed to be some sort of culvert, which did line up quite well with some of the paths that appeared on the 1 to 500 town plan of Chester. But certainly as you go further down, you are seeing definitely Roman walls. And of course, we are in the area of the barrack blocks here, and it seems clear that that's what we're dealing with, even if you can't hope to interpret everything on the basis of just what is a narrow slit trench, really. But just moving on to the next slide, these are some of the more spectacular stuff in the trench. Here we can see on the left concrete flooring of the barrack blocks with further surfaces underneath and walling with wall plaster on it. And then in the right hand thing, we've got, or the right hand slide, we've got claps on the right hand side, but there we've got also wall plaster in situ against the stone walls. So what's that? That's about 50 centimeters high. Blue wall plaster paint, apparently. And I'm pleased to say that they were able to remove that in a block and conserve it. So that was that was despite the very difficult conditions, it was removed without it all falling apart, really. So some good archaeology there, basically. And okay, it's keyhole stuff, basically. But I think this is one of the things that will be, in the report that comes out of it, we'll be able to plot these locations and see how they fit in with the plans that exist already for the layout of the barrack blocks in this part of Chester. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm conscious time is getting on, so I'll just whiz through these fairly quickly. Here we are in the northeast area of the area of the former bus station, which we were not seeking preservation in situ for. As I've said, we managed to secure it for much of the area, but this is a basement area for the new cinema, and this all had to go. And when they went down into it, we found what we take to be not quite the northeast corner, but certainly an eastern portion of the stores building. I think in the left-hand slide, you can see the stone wall running across the slide, which I think has been interpreted as the east wall of the stores building. Various surfaces outside of it, so beyond the slide. And then inside, you have this dark deposit, which seems to be some sort of midden, and which contained, as well as environmental samples, obviously, quite a lot of pottery, bits of glass, and various finds, which is currently being excavated. So if we look at the next slide, here's just some of the finds that came from that. The key, I think there's a bone comb, a chisel, an iron spearhead, obviously with lots of conglomerate, and then this token, or whatever it is, of which there's been some debate, which I'm not qualified to follow, but certainly some interesting finds from there. There was also a very nice piece of glass, which we don't have a slide of, basically. But yes, it seems like some sort of rubbish type midden deposit, basically. Next slide, please. Okay, I just put these ones in just to show that it was within the context of this ongoing development work that much of the mitigation occurred, the archaeological mitigation. The archaeologists were working amidst all this, well, it seems like chaos. It isn't. It's all well-planned development. But crucially, the archaeology was all keyed into this. At various stages, the archaeologists would move on to do a specific piece of work, just like any other subcontractor within the development team. And I think it was that close cooperation and integration of the archaeological team that allowed things to work so well. So next slide, please. Here we see some of the piling arrays. So the piles have gone in here and areas are being excavated in order to accommodate the pile caps. So in most instances, you can see here, they've removed the overburden, the black topsoil. And in some instances, they're down onto archaeological surfaces. And there was some minimal disturbance in some areas. But the idea was then that terram and sand would be laid down, and the concrete pile caps would be laid over the top of that, thus not causing any more damage to the archaeology than was caused by the pile caps. So these are areas of, where particularly important supports for the development were to be put in, and these are areas that we saw evaluated previously. Next slide, please. So more slides showing piles, and again, obviously there's archaeological surfaces exposed here. I just ask you to notice that the piles are in, but they have done minimal damage to the surrounding archaeology. People often say, well, surely the piles are going to completely wreck the surrounding archaeology. And some versions of piles would do that. But these ones are what they call CFA piles, continuous fluted auger, where they drill the hole, take the arisings out, and at the same time pump the concrete in. And that does seem to do minimal damage to the archaeology. So I think that's it's useful to be able to demonstrate that. Next one, please. Just very quickly, the offsite drainage. Here are some slides of the access pits that were dug. So this one here on the left shows some very little significant archaeology exposed. The one on the left is on Nicholas Street and shows the cellars of some of the 18th century, 19th century buildings that would have formerly lined the narrower Nicholas Street. No evidence of anything earlier than that. The one on the right is the one at the HQ roundabout, carefully sited to avoid the post-medieval graveyard of St. Bridget's. But despite that, there was a huge great hole there full of post-medieval pottery, which we hadn't really expected because it's too far north to be the castle ditch. And we're not quite sure what it is. It may be some sort of unrecorded quarrying or something like that, really, but post-medieval pottery all the way to the bottom. Should also say that the trench was drilled underneath the city wall and didn't do any damage to the city wall, I'm pleased to say. And I think, fine, just next slides, just to close. Yeah, just some more slides of the access pits. It's all a bit Quatermass in the pit, isn't it, really? But there you go. And then finally, yeah, I just thought they were worth showing some slides of the access pits down into the bedrock. And then just finally again, this just shows the tunnelling machine breaking through into the concrete shafts. So I think even if you found my talk a little bit boring, I think you'd probably find it was worthwhile just for this, just for these slides, really, because they are so spectacular with seeing this machine in operation. So I'm sorry, I'm conscious I've overrun a few bit. I was only supposed to speak for 50 minutes, but that's really the end of the talk.